This week we are talking institutional control. So, as we covered in a previous week, we're looking at the division of institutions based on public, private, and for-profit. So, beyond those categories, what is institutional control? Well, institutional control can be boiled down to the idea that to whom is the leadership of the institution accountable. So we're going to go through sector by sector and break that down. So let's start with public institutions. But before we think about that accountability piece, let's think about this question. What makes public institutions public? Well, there could be a number of perspectives, but I don't want to go in a sort of long, drawn-out video for this module. So we previously read about resource dependency. And for public institutions, so much of what happens is predicated on the fact that the institution is reliable to a very large extent on external resources from public sources, i.e. tax dollars. So in one way, that's part of what makes public institutions public, is that resource piece. Another, so let's think about the aspect of accountability, is that public institutions, obviously there's the board of regents or trustees or supervisors or overseers or whatever the language is in a particular state or system. But beyond that board oversight, the public institution is accountable to the public, not just because of resources, but because of state statute, state constitution, legislative fiat, whatever mechanism was exercised for the establishment of the institution as a publicly chartered institution. So let's think about private institutions. And with privates, the resource dependency issue is there, but not in the same way that it is for public institutions. For the privates, everything is driven by enrollment. And so as long as they are able to predict with some level of certainty their forthcoming enrollment, whether if they predict declines in enrollment, they predict bumps in enrollment, or predict a fairly level state of enrollment, resource dependency isn't there the way that it is with publics as a control element. When it comes to that accountability piece with privates, it can vary. For some privates, the accountability is really about being answerable to the board for that institution. But then there are other privates where there is accountability beyond the immediacy of the board. So let's take, for example, some religiously affiliated institutions. The religious institution might be accountable to a congregation of faith or a system of faith. We can take some privates that are in the southeastern United States that have ties to the Southern Baptist Convention, and the institutions have a strong level of accountability to the Southern Baptist Convention. For example, Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, actually was able to sever its formal ties with the Southern Baptist Convention. It still has Baptist roots, and much of what it does as an institution is rooted in the practices of faith within that community. But it no longer has those formal connections. So Furman's accountability measures really end at its own boards. Or if we want to go closer to home with Freed-Hardeman University, it is governed by the Church of Christ and is directly and does have direct accountability with the Church of Christ beyond its board, but all of its board members are members of the Church of Christ, and so there's that interplay there. And so privates are tricky. And then when we think about private historically black colleges, uh, because of the Second Moral Act that we touched on previously when looking at institutional diversity, even though the Second Moral Act was really, generally we think about the public HBCUs as being the recipients and beneficients of that act and the funding and land grant from it. Private HBCUs were actually on the receiving end of that as well. And so there are private HBCUs that have some accountability to the federal government through the title money that comes through to support HBCUs. And so we see that the private landscape is sometimes difficult to lump together because there's not a universal kind of overarching principle that guides the control of those institutions. So there's varying states of accountability. And so one of the things that I like to, and this isn't really about institutional control, but that I think it's important to think about is what is it that makes any particular type. I've got private institutions shown on the screen here, but think about what makes any particular type of institution appealing to students. And the answer is it's probably not about institutional type. There's something about the individual institution. Some students choose particular privates because of the religious affiliation and religious practices. Some students might choose a particular religiously affiliated institution because there's an affiliation, but not necessarily a strong connection to particular dogmatic practices. So I think about some of the Catholic institutions in this country. Now, the big name brand or medallion institution we might think about is Notre Dame. Catholic in name, and there's some Catholic practices, but having spoken with people and being related to people who have attended Notre Dame, I definitely get a sense that it's not a strict Catholic school type of experience as what we might think from a parochial K-12 Catholic school setting. Kind of compare that to maybe a Jesuit institution such as Marquette or maybe even St. Louis University, where there's more connection to Catholic faith and Catholic teachings through the curriculum and through the daily practices on those campuses. And then for students who choose public institutions, is it something about the appeal of the particular institution, or is it an economic choice? And so one of the things that we know from the literature on college choice is that it's actually a fairly complicated process for us to really attempt to boil down. That there's no one set thing that's going to drive one student to one institution, but then drive a different student to another institution. So for me, price was a determinant in figuring out where I was going to attend college. For other students I graduated high school with, it was all about academic program and then availability scholarships and or things like that. And so figuring out, okay, what's the appeal aspect of different types? There's so much variance, but there is a lot of rich research that's been done about college choice. So that's a little bit of a tangent. So I want to make sure that in this online class, I do everything I can to match the experience of the face-to-face class. And so, as you all know, you've had me in a face-to-face class. No class with me would be complete without at least one tangent. So when we think about external factors that impact private institutions, I mentioned the impact of the federal government through funding with historically black colleges and universities. Private colleges of any sector that accept federal financial aid are also beholden to various federal statutes. Um, and so those are factors that impact private institutions. Sometimes we think about privates as just having carte blanche to do whatever it is they want to do, but there are expectations and standards. Private institutions also have the external pressures and scrutiny of accrediting bodies, and so there are those external factors and pressures that do impact private institutions. And so the accountability piece, as we think about it from this perspective, becomes even more nuanced and even more fuzzy. That it's not as cut and dry as we may have initially thought when beginning the course. And so let's talk about for-profit institutions. So when you hear for-profit, what comes to mind? Is it someplace like the University of Phoenix, or maybe it's Walden University? Well, did you know that there are actually a number of different types of for-profit institutions? That there's the big national online institution that has that big presence, but there are also regional institutions. There are what would be considered neighborhood or local institutions. So we might see the different campuses of ITT Tech. Now that is a national institute, and so it's got campuses all over the country. But what about a local institute that's focused on a particular trade? We see this, one of the most common ones that we see are schools of cosmetology. Now that would be a neighborhood institute. We might also think about a neighborhood college. So maybe we have an institution that awards associate's degrees, but it's a for-profit institution, and it's local. It serves a very distinct geographic area, and really doesn't draw people from outside of that location. And so the landscape of regional for-profit institutions is also, it's not as simple as just thinking about Phoenix or any of the other large for-profits that we see advertising on television. That there is a wide range. I think about Virginia College, which would be a regional university. And ultimately, in terms of control, these are corporations. They are either publicly traded. Some of them might be just simply privately held. So in the case of a neighborhood institute, they may be a single owner, and so maybe the accountability there is to the people, to the entities to whom that owner pays bills. So the power bill, for example, or the licensing board to be able to award cosmetology licenses through or to be able to certify people for cosmetology licenses. And so these institutions, the accountability of them looks very different. Some of them do seek accreditation, but it is not a driving force. So with public and not-for-profit private institutions, accreditation is a pretty big deal. It's something that consumes the institutions, I guess you could say, because the last thing that you want to do as a public or not-for-profit where you're reliant on enrollment is, I mean, obviously every institution's reliant on enrollment, but when your funding is all about enrollment and retaining students, you want to make sure that you maintain accreditation. For the for-profit institutions, some of them do seek accreditation, and there's a reason that University of Phoenix is in Phoenix, and that there are actually a number of other private institutions that are based in the Phoenix area in that part of the country, is because the accrediting body for that region is much more open and understanding to the educational practices that for-profit institutions employ. One of the things that is a hang-up in the other 6 regions is the rolling start and stop and the accelerated nature of programs. Is not just that things are accelerated, it's the self-paced perspective. And so one of the concerns that the accreditors in our region, which is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, have raised when other for-profit institutions have sought accreditation, is that there's concern about the role of faculty. Is the institution simply posting materials and kind of leaving it to students to figure things out for themselves? And also there are concerns about, how much can we say that these institutions are really monitoring student progress and assessing student learning? And so that's been an area of concern when it comes to accreditation for-profit institutions. While it's important to understand these different sectors, we also need to think about post-secondary education as some type of system, and that's difficult to do in American higher education when there is so much variation, not only from sector to sector, but within sector. And a reason that we need to think about higher education as a system is that students do transfer and move from segment to segment. But we have so many barriers that make that transition difficult. And so as we think about instructional support systems, we need to really be paying a lot of attention to not only supporting transfer students once they get to us at our individual institution, but we need to, as we get into those positions where we're able to do so and have this type of influence, we need to be paying a lot of attention to the systems that are in place that make movement from our institution easy, or the systems that are in place that hinder that movement. Because there are definitely clogs in the transfer pipeline. We see students who begin at one institution and for some reason, whether it's they start at a 2-year institution or a for-profit and then decide they want to transfer to a 4-year either public or not-for-profit institution, they find that movement difficult. Their transfer of credits is an arduous process. A student is told, yeah, I see that you took this English literature class, but how can we be sure it's our English literature class, or is the quality of our English literature class? Like there's something about the way that we approach English literature that no other institution is capable of doing. And so we have to make sure that we're really looking at those practices, and we have to look at, from the instructional support system side, when we do have transfer students join us, what are we doing to make sure that they are able to integrate into the institution and not only transfer their credits, but have a meaningful experience of transferring what they've learned previously into the new environment.